afternoon, so let's go ahead and get started. First, just want to say thank you. Really appreciate you being here. I know these are busy days, last days of summer, school starting in a lot of places, a lot happening. So for you all to take time to come out and be a part of this means a lot to me, and I just want to say thank you. Really do appreciate your time and want this to be productive, want to get through as many questions as we can. Also just want to give a great shout out and thanks to Plainfield, but specifically the Plainfield Fire Department. This is an amazing facility, and Chief Riddle and his entire staff do just an amazing job. Chief Riddle is going to be our moderator today, so he'll be going through the questions, and we'll get started just in a minute. But again, I do want to just thank you so much. The goal here is honestly to hear from you and for us to be able to have a discussion. And my hope is, if there's anything we can help you with out of this meeting today, or things that maybe you're struggling with, or family members struggling with, or a neighbor, we're going to have our staff that'll be around that we would love to help. We'll stick around until the last person leaves to make sure if we can answer questions or be helpful, whether it's a veterans issue or an immigration issue or IRS issue or anything. We would love to be helpful if we could. We'll do our best. The other thing I want to say is it's been a busy year and a half and a tough year and a half. I think very unsettling for many of us, but we've certainly been working hard in Congress. We passed over 900 bills in the House of Representatives. 250 of those have been passed through the Senate as well. The vast majority of those 900 bills have been bipartisan bills. And so we're still 650 of the bills that have passed out of the House are waiting for action in the Senate. They're in session right now, so we're hoping some of those things are moving now. Continuing to work to make sure that our service women and men have the resources that they need to be successful in training, but also if where they're ever called to areas of conflict, that they can be safe. We've taken some important steps there as well. And we are seeing still continued challenges around the world with North Korea, Russia, Iran, Syria, but also grateful that we're seeing less noise and activity by ISIS. So I think that's a positive thing. Still so much that we need to be working on, but I want to talk through these issues, many others, opioids, human trafficking, whatever issues that you might have, we want to try and get through that. So with that, again, I want to thank the Plainfield Fire Department and specifically Chief Riddle. He's got just a quick safety update of if anything were to happen, what to do here, and then he will go ahead and start in questions. So Chief Riddle, thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Welcome everyone. We really appreciate you coming and using our facility for one of the purposes it was intended, and to have a great dialogue here this afternoon in the public setting. What we like to do in these kinds of events is to make sure that everyone knows what to do in case the fire alarm goes off. First thing we tell you is try to keep up with us, because we're leaving. And you can leave out of this exit door, or out the back and up the stairs, or right out here to the right is the exit onto the patio, and we'll direct you from there. But it's fully sprinklered building. We don't expect any issues, but if there are, that's what we'd expect. The washrooms are all the way down the hall against the wall. Take a left, and you'll be just fine. So does anybody have any questions for me? Again, welcome, and we'll go ahead and get started. First question is, gun silencers pose significant dangers in the wrong hands. The Hearing Protection Act, which now is part of the SHARE Act, is being considered in committee. This bill would result in the removal of silencers from the National Firearms Act. Will you work for this bill, allowing silencers into the wrong hands if it comes to the House floor?
I'm really concerned about these as well. We have seen in certain situations where silencers have been used for attacks and mass attacks. I just don't see a need for these. When I talk to most gun owners, this is not something that is vital or important for them to be able to enjoy their sport. And so I do think we need to make sure that these aren't part of general availability to public, and that they can't fall in the wrong hands. Larger discussion I hope we'll have is, what do we do, again, to make sure that we're addressing violence that continues to happen, gun violence that we see so prevalent. And I know all of us, as schools are starting up again, are holding our breath a little bit scared of what we might hear. And we need to do everything that we can to make sure that our schools are safe. Just driving through even some school zones through Plainfield as I was coming here midday today. And we have done some steps, we need to do more. We passed legislation just a couple of weeks ago that increased funding, grant fundings that goes directly to schools, $2.3 billion for school safety programs and school grant programs. Recognizing again that not every school district is going to have exactly the same challenges or the same solutions to make sure that students can be safe. So giving some flexibility there. I see it, schools in Plainfield will have a different challenge than schools up in Harvard or Hebron in the northern part of the 14th Congressional District. And so there has to be resources there that are available for schools to be able to do the work that they need to do to make sure that our students are safe. So specific with this issue, I would expect if this does move through committee that I would support making sure that there is limitations on these, that they can't fall into the wrong hands or be misused.
Okay, the next question is, what is your opinion on the Mueller investigation?
That's a good question. Well, I think it's very important, and I support it. I support it coming to real conclusions, real facts, as quickly as possible. I don't want this to drag out forever. I don't think that is productive for us. I do respect him. I think he has had a very strong, respectable career, and my hope is that we will get answers out of this that will close a lot of these questions, that we'll be able to make a determination of next steps that ought to happen if laws were broken, if people violated the law, that we ought to know what we do next. So I support it. I think it ought to continue. I do think it would be good for all of us if it finished up as quickly as possible. The longer it drags on, I think the further away some of these activities were. So again, I will continue to support it, but we'll also hope that we get answers soon.
Okay. Will you vote in favor of protecting the waters of the Great Lakes and supporting funding for Great Lakes water initiatives? If not, why not?
I absolutely will support that. Great Lakes, specifically Lake Michigan, is a treasure. Millions of people rely on Lake Michigan and the health of Lake Michigan for clean drinking water. And it is such a vital resource for the Midwest, the Great Lakes are. So I have been active. This is something that our delegation, Republicans and Democrats, don't agree on everything, but this is something that absolutely does bring us together, of saying we need to do everything we possibly can to protect the Great Lakes. I'll continue to support funding for that. I'll continue to support local commissions that are overseeing how the Great Lakes are doing. There have been some very positive things, even in the last years. Water levels are coming back up. Again, I think there are positives there, but we always have to be wary too of invasive species that potentially could come in or other pollution that could happen. So I'll continue to support efforts that Illinois is doing, that Midwest states are doing, but also the federal government funding that needs to continue to recognize how vital the Great Lakes are, and that we can't let anything come in that would damage the vitality of the Great Lakes.
Okay. I strongly believe that climate change is the most important issue for the country and the world. What is your position?
I believe it's a very important issue. I do believe in the reality of climate change. I do believe we have responsibility to be a part of solutions for climate change. I do think there's disagreements of how, if it is the most important issue, or if it's the second or third most important issue. But I don't think that ought to matter. I think it is important. I think we all ought to recognize it's important, and we ought to do everything that we can to do the right things to make sure that we are protecting the environment, that we are incentivizing people and punishing people who are breaking laws, who are polluting, who are damaging our air or our water. I think we need to do more to push back against other nations that are much worse offenders than we are of violations. Countries like China and India that have very few regulations and have very high pollution, recognizing that what happens any place in the world potentially impacts every other part of the world. So this is something that's really important. I still believe strongly that we need bipartisan solutions to this. It's a reason why I joined a bipartisan caucus called the Climate Solutions Caucus. It's exactly bipartisan, the same number of Democrats and Republicans. We meet often to discuss what are real solutions, what is a real positive way that we can do this that's good for our economy, but also will be great for our kids and our grandkids. And it's one of these things that I'm going to continue to work towards and fight for, but also grateful for some of the scientific research that's going on. I see it very specifically in our area where we're blessed to have two great laboratories close by us, Fermilab, Argonne, and Argonne especially has been working quite a bit on climate issues and renewable energy. Their specific focus is on battery storage and recognizing that to maximize value of renewable sources of energy, we need to continue to maximize battery storage. And they're seeing positive options there. Also met with a group of scientists a couple of weeks ago who came to Chicago. It was 100 plus of the top scientists around the nation and around the world talking about hydrogen and potential positive future impact of hydrogen in energy. It was very interesting and exciting steps, and that's something I'm very supportive of as well. Funding research, realizing that that's something that is going to be important of future discoveries that, again, can ultimately replace fossil fuels.
Illinois is 5th in the nation in structurally deficient bridges, 2,303 bridges. How can you defend any corporate tax cuts while our infrastructure crumbles?
Well, I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think it's a separate thing. I support an infrastructure bill. I will continue to do that. I supported it when I served in the state legislature. And we've seen incredible work. One of the things that was important to me when I was in the state legislature was Route 59 and improvements on Route 59. And we were able to get some significant things done there by passing a real infrastructure bill. This is something, again, that traditionally has not been a partisan issue. Fixing our bridges, fixing our roads, fixing our rails, making sure that our rivers, locks, and dams work is not something that is a Democratic issue or a Republican issue or a House issue or a Senate issue. It ought to be something that brings us together. And so I will continue to push for and support and tell this story exactly like the question said, that this has to be a priority of ours. It is something that I believe we can get done. My hope is we can still get it done this year, because the longer we wait, these bridges don't become safer or less expensive to fix the longer we wait. They get more dangerous and more expensive. And it's this question of, are we going to do this work, or are we going to push it off on our kids and grandkids to have to do the work? I think we ought to do the work right now. Figure out, again, how to pay for it. I think it makes sense for people who are using our roads, our bridges, our rails, our rivers and locks and dams, that their users ought to help pay for the repairs of these things. We've seen that work certainly with the tollway here in Illinois, and I think that we need creative ideas of making sure that we can upgrade our roads and bridges and make sure that we never have a tragedy. I went to school up in Minnesota, not too many miles away from that bridge that collapsed 10 years ago, and I went over that bridge hundreds of times. And I know we've got bridges that are in worse condition than that bridge that collapsed in Minnesota 10 years ago. So we need to do this now. I'm going to continue to push for this, and I'm hopeful it can be something we can get done in a bipartisan way.
But isn't that what our motor fuel tax is supposed to do, or is that?
That's a good question, and it is, and it does some, but basically it's just been enough to keep up with filling potholes. It's just not enough to deal with structural brokenness. And we've had a real problem, especially in Illinois. The motor fuels tax has been swept by both Republican governors and Democratic governors over the last year, swept out of being used to pay for roads and road projects, and being put into general funds or other spending. And I think that is horrible. It never should have happened. It should never happen. We did have a referendum recently that did pass, which I think is grateful, of making sure that we're protecting motor fuels tax in Illinois, that it can only be used for roads. That hasn't always been the case. Now, the national motor fuels tax does have that protection. It absolutely, so any federal tax we pay when we buy gasoline absolutely can only be used for improvements to transportation. It can't be swept away or used for anything else. Finally, Illinois now is in the same situation. But even there, it's not enough to take care of the significant structural deficiencies that we've got in so many bridges and roads. And locks and dams is something that we don't think about very much, and yet it is vital for Illinois manufacturing and Illinois agriculture. And many of these locks and dams are literally decades and decades and decades old, and beyond their life expectancy. So a failure there would be catastrophic, certainly to our economy, but also could be incredibly costly to have to fix at that point.
This is about income tax. The tax break caps our mortgage deduction at $10,000. It eliminates our state income tax deduction. We are retired, and this raises our taxes as corporations are reduced permanently. Tell us how we voters in Illinois, especially those of us who are retired, have been helped by your vote on this law.
Well, looking, and I've met with accountants, I've met with teachers, I've met with fire folks, and 9 out of 10 people who live in the 14th Congressional District have seen reduction in their taxes. We're also seeing a growing economy. I was frustrated as well that we are a high tax state. We're one of a handful of states that are very high taxes. There's more states that are low taxes than states that are high taxes. And that's how this got in this provision. And originally there wasn't going to be any benefit, there wasn't going to be any flexibility to be able to use this $10,000 for income tax or property tax, where we get to choose, or a combination of the two. One of the things that I'm talking about and working towards is to make sure that every individual keeps that $10,000. One of my concerns is, right now, if you're married or if you jointly own a house, you just have the one $10,000 deduction for that. I think you ought to both keep that deduction if it's a jointly owned home to get that maximum benefit from it. Definitely there's things that I want to fix, I am supportive of, and I'm going to continue to push for permanence in the individual rates. That was in our version that passed out of the House. It was not in the version that passed out of the Senate. I think that's a mistake. I think this is something that we can hopefully finish up this fall. I will support it. Want to see continued growth in the economy, but I also realize there needs to be ongoing fixes to the law that was passed.
And I think you answered that with this next question, but will the tax cuts be made permanent?
Well, they haven't been yet. My hope is and belief is they will be made permanent. I hope that happens again as soon as we get back right after Labor Day. But we're certainly going to push for it. Again, we've already shown that we can support that and will support that in the House. But we need to see what the Senate will do and can do. I think there is a likelihood that they will support that.
President Trump believes the media is the enemy of the people. Do you agree?
I don't. I disagree with him here. I think the press and a free press is a vital asset that a free nation has, and the moment we start feeling like we can do without a free press, I think we are in huge trouble. And we see it so clearly in places like Russia, and let me just say a word, and maybe there's going to be some more questions about Russia as well, but I see Vladimir Putin as an enemy. I don't see him as a friend. I look at Putin and see KGB, someone who has it in his heart and every desire in his body to destroy democracy. And so I will do everything I can to push back against him, but also recognize the failures that we see in Russia. And one very clear example is when Russia invaded Ukraine, Crimea, and the very first thing they did was shut down any free press in those areas. We see it happening in China, we see it in other dictatorships in different places in Africa and other places where the first thing that a dictator does, or someone who doesn't want freedom to the people, is to destroy free press. And so I'm going to continue to speak up and fight for the freedom of our press. At the same time, I'm also going to speak up and mention to people that we need to be good consumers of information, and we need to teach our kids to be good consumers of information as well, recognizing that pretty much anything has some perspective to it. So if I'm watching Fox News 24 hours a day, I'm only getting one perspective. And I'm encouraging people to see more. If I'm watching MSNBC 24 hours a day, I'm only getting one perspective. And I think it's important to recognize that there's diversity in our country, and we need to be getting a greater perspective on information and be good consumers of our own information. And that certainly applies to what we read on the internet as well, of having multiple sources that we can check back and prove that finding what is true and what is not true. So as much as I support the free press and want to make sure that the free press continues, I also want to make sure that people realize that not everything you read on the internet is true, and you need to be careful of what information you take in and make sure that there's a balance there. And I think it is part of the challenges that we're facing of such high emotions and anger is that in some ways I think we have lost an ability to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. And I think that is a challenge that we have to continue to work through.
Can I ask a follow-up?
We're going to keep going through questions if that's all right. I'll stick around if there's other questions that people have. Feel free to write a question out. Just feel free to write it out and we'll go through it. We just want to give everybody a chance.
Freedom of the press, I could let him answer. This is an important topic right now.
I feel like I've answered it.
But can you give us examples of
Yeah, we don't hear it.
and doing something about that?
Specifically, multiple hearings. I'm co-chairman of the Tom Lantis Human Rights Commission, and we have spoken multiple times of importance of freedom of the press in other countries. In China, for Tibet.
What about here?
Here, I've spoken up multiple times, and this is going to be the last time I do this because we want to have everybody have a chance to do this. But here, we've had multiple opportunities to speak back of attacks that President Trump has had against certain personalities and certain press entities. I have spoken out. I will continue to speak out. I've said it in committee. I've said it on the floor. I've said it in press releases. I've said it in open meetings, and I will continue to do that. Let's continue with this process that we've set up.
Given your involvement in human rights, what do you believe is our responsibility in reuniting families separated at our nation's borders that, to date, are still apart?
We need to continue to do everything we possibly can to reunite families. I believe in family. I believe in keeping families together. This is a horrible tragedy that has gone on far too long and is worse now than it's ever been before. We need to make sure that we bring families back together again. And so I voted. This also has to be done legislatively. It can't be just by executive order. That's what we have right now, is just an executive order to bring families back together. We need to continue to work through the courts. The Flores decision still is a challenge of figuring out how do we keep families together going through this process. But we can do this. We took steps in legislation that I voted for and supported when it was probably about a month ago out in Washington, D.C. that would have brought true legislative solutions, bringing families together, and a clarity that this would never happen again. It's worse now, and we're more aware of it now than ever, but this is something that has been going on for years and should not be happening. We should do everything we can to be keeping families together.
Institutionalized corruption has always been a problem, but has become rampant in the age of Citizens United. Far from representing speech and therefore more input for the average American voter, like your constituents here today, political payola assures that our input means almost nothing compared to the access and control that wealthy donors wield over you and your colleagues in Congress. And most disturbingly, this includes foreign nations and actors who donate to your campaigns via third parties like the NRA. What have you done to ensure that our government does not slide into oligarchy controlled by the wealthiest few Americans and even foreigners?
Well, I continue to support Federal Election Commission reporting, making sure that people can see exactly who is donating to different campaigns. I do think it is very important to make sure that we are aware of who is making donations to different candidates and where those donations are coming from. It's something that I'm very proud of, that you look at the number of people who've donated to my campaign, the vast majority are from this district, and that's important to me. I do think, can you say the first part of the question? I'm sorry, Captain. I want to make sure I cover it all.
Institutionalized corruption, political payola that ensures our input means almost nothing compared to the access and control that wealthy donors wield over you and your colleagues.
Thank you. That came back to me. So it is, I'm concerned about super PACs. I think these are a huge problem that we're going to have to continue to work through. I do think they have an impact on the value of individuals. This was a Supreme Court decision. So there are things that we're going to have to continue to push through court decisions. Hopefully that there will be a change there. Possibly having legislation that can look at addressing what super PACs can do or what limitations could happen there. We have no say. If there is a super PAC who gets involved in a campaign, by definition, it cannot be coordinated with the candidate. It has to happen completely separately. I think, again, the idea there is to make sure that we're not benefiting from them or telling them what we want them to do. But oftentimes, they do exactly what I don't want them to do is what they would do, and I've heard of other candidates the same thing. So I think it is important for us to make sure that every vote counts, and I will tell you that I'm grateful that there are limitations on what entities can give to us. An individual can give more to me than an entity can give to me. And I think that's really important. So I will continue to support that and continue to push as best as I can to get support that I can get from people who are in the district. I do think it's important that we still can have this process of being able to reach out and that anybody can run for office, not just billionaires, like we're seeing sometimes here in Illinois. I don't think that's healthy either, so I think it ought to be something that's open, that anybody who wants to run for office ought to be able to run, but we ought to know how they're funding their campaign, and I'll continue to support making sure if laws are violated, that those people are punished, and making sure that the FEC rules and regulations continue to be strong, and that there are disclosures and that people can be very clear of who is supporting what candidates, and that can be part of your decision of if you're going to support that candidate or not because of who they're receiving support from.
This question's about net neutrality. 84% of Americans support open internet rules, and the FCC saw overwhelming public support for preserving these protections. However, the FCC moved forward eliminating net neutrality. The Republican-controlled Senate passed the net neutrality CRA in support of preserving these protections. Now we need the House to pass the same. However, Speaker Ryan will not bring this to a vote. My question is, would you vote yes on the net neutrality CRA if it was brought to the floor?
I would vote no. I am still for an open and free internet. I'm for the internet that was functioning when Google was started and grown, when Facebook was started and grown, when Netflix was started and grown. And I believe, again, this is a turf battle between all the letter departments, FCC and FTC. For years, it functioned very well under FTC, where they've got real ability to enforce penalties and be able to reimburse consumers, customers, if there's an abuse. The FCC has no power to do that. If there is an abuse, if there is a violation, they cannot enforce penalties and reimburse consumers back. I think that's wrong. I used the internet a couple times already this morning. It worked great for me, and it is currently under that system that was in place, again, when Google and Facebook started up. I think it's the right way to go. It's light touch oversight that works. I still believe so strongly, too, in the reality that need for certain information to be able to travel more quickly, like my medical health records. If I'm in an accident an hour away from my doctor and it's a life-threatening situation, I believe my medical records ought to have a super highway, basically, to that other emergency room to make sure that information can get there. And I think with some of the changes that was limited of that ability to do that. There still are very clear laws that if there is any violation, penalties will be in place and consumers can be reimbursed if there is any loss.
Numerous representatives, including yourself, have met with many community leaders regarding Canadian National Railroad's thoughtless and disruptive practices. Why is this still being tolerated?
It's very frustrating to me. We saw some progress. I think we saw some things a little bit better. Chief, I'd love to talk with you a little bit further, too, of the challenges that puts on you. It's unacceptable, and I've made it very clear to them that it's unacceptable. We saw some positive things happen. Now we're hearing from the northern end of the district some of the same problems and same challenges. This cannot be. They have to make sure that they are not blocking access for emergency vehicles and even people going to school to pick up their kids or going to work. So I have literally had many conversations, many letters, many meetings with the railroad, and again, we saw some progress and then we see it fall back. We're continuing to push to make lasting change to make sure that this doesn't happen. It's important, certainly to have rail access. It's something that's important for Plainfield. I meet with the leadership here in Plainfield often, and I know a lot of the companies that we have here would not be here but for access to the trains. So it's a good thing that it's here, but it's a bad thing that it's so disruptive, and that is unacceptable, and we need to continue to fight for a solution, and I want to be a part of having that. We haven't seen it yet. We've seen a few positives, but not enough.
This is about health care. Everyone understands that health care is costly, and in the U.S. we pay the most out of all the industrialized nations and get the least care. On top of this already expensive health care costs, we had the cost of health insurance, which adds another 33%. In a previous phone town hall, I asked you the question, why do you support adding the additional costs of health insurance? And you said you do not support a one-size-fits-all approach, that people should be able to choose different policies. 50% of all bankruptcies in the U.S. are people with health insurance policies. My question today is, if a person chooses a policy that does not cover their illness, what does the family do?
Well, there is